So we have 2 weeks of life groups left. This week we're going to finish Commandments 7 and 8. Next week we're going to get into Commandment 9 and 10. So this week we pick up in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. It says, "You shall not commit adultery." Verse 15, "You shall not steal." So these are the 7th and 8th commandments. Both have to do with defrauding your neighbor by taking something that is rightfully theirs or lawfully theirs. First case, of course, is their spouse, and the other case would be in stealing, would be something to do with their property or something like that. So first we want to deal with adultery. Adultery in its simplest form is basically just going outside of the marriage for sexual fulfillment. And I want to give it that kind of broad term because Jesus really gave it that broad term in the New Testament, where he talked about it's not just the physical act of adultery, but it's also adultery of the heart. So I think the simplest way to encompass it is just to say God designed sex for marriage, and so going outside of your own marriage or going into someone else's marriage for sexual fulfillment is essentially what adultery is. Now, if we were to go around the room tonight and I was to ask everybody, raise your hand if you plan on committing adultery sometime in the near future. Probably no one would raise their hand because it's not something that people plan on. And when they get married, no one gets married planning, oh yeah, at some point I'm going to have an affair, in my marriage. It's not something that people plan on doing, but yet it happens. As a matter of fact, statistically, the Journal of Couple and Relationship Therapy states that 50% of women and 60% of men will have an extramarital affair at some point in their marriage. This is double from what it was 10 years ago. So obviously sexual unfaithfulness is on the rise. Sexual promiscuity in general in our culture is on the rise. Use of pornography, seeing sexually explicit material in movies, television, commercials, ads, books, novels, etc. It's all on the rise. And so naturally, adultery, being a sexual sin, is going to be on the rise as well. But for believers, we need to know what the Bible says about it, and we need to know how to guard against it. So first of all, I think it's important we understand the seriousness of this sin. Because in the Old Testament, the penalty was death by stoning. So it was pretty severe. There wasn't, there were only a few crimes in the Old Testament that the penalty for that sin was death, and adultery was one of those. So in our society, if we were still following biblical law, or we were still living in a biblical culture, there'd be a lot of people dead, including a lot of people in the church, because this is something that is a problem in the church world as well, and among believers as well. Now, we're not here tonight to dig up anybody's past. We're not here to, if you're married, it's possible we have people listening to this that are married and they're listening to this together tonight, and there have been these types of issues in their marriage. We're not here to relitigate the past. We're not here to unscramble eggs. You can't do that. So what's done has been done, and all we can do is move forward from here. We can't, go back and bring up old wounds. What we're talking about tonight, though, is how do we avoid this going forward? How do we avoid this for the future? How do we set up parameters and boundaries so that we can obey this commandment and this doesn't, happen in our lives? So in the Old Testament, the penalty for adultery was stoning to death. In the New Testament, the consequences are divorce. The Bible states, Jesus stated very clearly in the New Testament that God hates divorce. But in the case of adultery, he said it was permissible. So it was actually the only thing that Jesus said that's a good reason to get a divorce, is because one person went outside of the marriage for sexual fulfillment. It doesn't mean that you have to get a divorce. He just said it was permissible that you could get a divorce. There are some instances where couples decide to work through it and get healing, and that can happen. It's difficult. It changes the marriage forever. But it can be done with God's help. Their healing can come after the result of it. It reminds me of something that happened in my life years ago. I was on staff at a church, and I was living in the parsonage on the church property, and I decided to plant some fruit bushes in the yard. So I'd planted some blueberry bushes and some blackberry bushes out in the yard, and They were starting to grow. I don't remember how old they were, probably, over a year old, but they were starting to grow. And I had them marked and everything. And our lawn guy one day, he didn't show up, but he sent someone else in one of his workers in his place. And the lawn guy mowed right over my blueberry and my blackberry bushes. So they I walked out there and they looked like they had just disappeared, but upon further inspection, I saw that they had been mowed over completely by his zero-turn mower, just buzzed them right down to the ground. And I went out and I looked, and it didn't take me just a few seconds to realize that all the time spent cultivating, developing these beautiful, precious bushes of mine had been destroyed in one instant, in one decision, in one moment. My beautiful cultivation had been destroyed. They weren't dead, but they were never going to be the same again. And what I had spent time building was now going to have to be started over. That's a lot like adultery. That's a lot how adultery works, is in a moment, something that has been spent being cultivated, the marriage developed, it's just severed. Trust is broken. The relationship is broken. And really, that relationship will never quite be the same again after that. It doesn't mean that it can't be repaired, and it doesn't mean that there can't be healing brought to it. But there are some decisions that the consequences are very severe. And that's why it's one of the 10 Commandments. That's why God warns against it. He said, do not violate the covenant by going outside of marriage. That's very important, because some may be sitting here and go, oh, well, I'm good. Okay, I've never committed adultery. Don't have plans to. No big deal. I did not violate the 7th commandment. I'm good to go. Except that in the New Testament, Jesus made it clear that heart adultery is the same thing as physical and actual adultery. And he defines heart adultery as looking at another person lustfully and desiring to be with them, or desiring to commit adultery with them. So what does this look like in practicality, in reality? Does it mean every time you've looked at another woman and thought she was beautiful, or another man and thought they were beautiful, that you committed adultery? No, I don't believe that. I don't believe it's the same thing as seeing beauty. I don't believe it's the same thing as seeing something inappropriate and then faithfully guarding your eyes or your thoughts towards it. I don't even think it's the same thing as being tempted, but then responding correctly and responding appropriately. For example, one study found that 74% of men say that they would commit adultery if they knew they would never get caught. And 68% of women said that they would commit adultery if they knew they would never get caught. So this is what Jesus was getting at. He knew that. And he knew that that's in people's hearts. So what he was saying is, it doesn't matter that you didn't actually do the act. Is it in your heart, and would you do it? And that's what God is always after. He's not just about rigid obedience on the outside. He's about us being completely transformed on the inside, and being people that are like him in character, in thought, in motive, in heart, in intent. So that's why he doesn't just leave it at, oh, well, you didn't do the act. Yeah, but if it's in your heart, then it's the same thing anyway. By Jesus' definition, the use of pornography would absolutely be adultery in modern day times. It's so important to understand that, because I think a lot of people think they get a pass because, well, they deal with pornography, but I've never cheated on my spouse. Not true. You're going outside of the marriage for sexual fulfillment. In the mind of God, it's a sin on its own, whether you're married or not. That makes no difference. It is a sexual sin. But specifically for someone who's married, it would qualify as adultery. The use of pornography is damaging to the relationship. It goes against God's commandments, and it's not something that should be a part of any believer's life. So how do we protect ourselves against adultery and against sexual sin in general? In Proverbs chapter 5, there's actually a whole chapter written on the dangers of adultery, what it does to a person, what it does to their relationship with God, and how to guard yourself against it. We don't have time to read the entire chapter tonight, but I would encourage you to go back and read it. It's Proverbs chapter 5. You'll find a lot of valuable information, but I am going to give you 3 things that we find in that passage. The first one is to have clear boundaries in your life. In verse 8, He says, keep your way far from her, talking about the immoral woman or an immoral woman or an immoral person. Keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. So this is just clear boundaries. Why put yourself in a working situation? Why hire a secretary? Why have a friend that you know is going to lead, that you know could possibly lead you down the wrong path? He says, stay far away from that person. Don't go near as possible, but then hope you're going to be able to make the right decision. It says stay far away. Number one is to set clear boundaries. I'm amazed at how many Christian people are so foolish to have close friends of the opposite sex. This is a hot topic and people get upset about it. Like, why can't I have friends of the opposite sex? Because it's foolish. That's why. Because you're setting yourself up for problems. You need to set clear boundaries. It says stay far away from that type of relationship. It's a recipe for problems. Martin Luther, speaking on this subject, said it's like putting straw next to a fire and hoping it won't burn. So it's just not wisdom to do that. The second thing he tells us to do in Proverbs chapter 5 is to visualize the devastation that is going to come in your life as a result of your sin, as a result of committing adultery. And you may think, well, that's not fun to visualize the devastation, but it helps you. It's a deterrent. It helps you stay away from doing it. In verse 9, he says, you will lose all honor and respect. Your strength and wealth will go to a stranger. So what is he doing? He's helping you to see what it's going to look like if you go down that path. He said you're going to lose your honor, you're going to lose respect, you're going to lose everything you work for. In many cases, you're going to lose your business, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your money, you're going to lose your 401k. It's going to cause you a lot of problems. So he says visualize what would happen if I choose this, and is it worth it? Count the cost. Is this really worth losing my wife, losing my kids, destroying my reputation, destroying my family? Is that really worth it? He says count the cost and visualize what would come from it as a result. And the third thing that he tells us to do in this passage is to have a great sex life with our own spouse so that we're not wanting to go outside of the marriage for sexual fulfillment. In verse 18, he says, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. So he says one of the best deterrents to adultery is just being satisfied in your own marriage and in your own life. And I know that even for many Christian couples, that's not the case. And so what I would tell you tonight, we've got a very short time to discuss all of these things. We're trying to cram so much in. But what I would tell you is, if that's not the case, just understand that you're opening yourself up for problems. And so you've got to be willing to do whatever it takes to solve any issues that you may be having in your marriage in that way. Sometimes there are physical issues. Sometimes there's abuse that happened in a person's past that is causing problems. There's all sorts of things that can cause a married couple to not be experiencing fulfillment in their sexual relationship. But what you have to be committed to do is say, you know what, we're not only committed to each other, we're committed to keeping sin out. We're committed to keeping adultery out. So we're going to fix this. And if we have to go see a counselor, if we have to read books together, if we have to go to counseling together, I'm committed to you enough to work through this and figure out, what we're going to do. And keep in mind, it's not enough that one person is satisfied. It's not enough that I'm happy with the way things are. Yes, but that's not a deterrent to adultery. Both people have to be happy and satisfied in the marriage. So that's important, and that's a commitment that you have to make to each other. Okay, moving on to the 8th commandment, do not steal. This is another one of those commandments that a lot of Christians would read and go, oh, check the box, man. No problem. I don't steal. Not an issue. Well, not so fast, because there are modern day ways in which I believe that Christians violate this commandment. And I'm going to just list a few here. Obviously, the most blatant way is outright stealing. Just taking something that's not yours and you know it and stealing. I don't think a lot of people that are in life groups tonight probably deal with that or participate with that. You're probably not shoplifting, or it could be, but I don't think that the people who are in life groups tonight really struggle with just outright theft. But in every one of these commandments, you'll notice there's like a blatant violation, just obvious blatant, but then there are lesser forms of that same sin. And so don't just let yourself off the hook right away. Here's some ways that I see Christian people violate this. One way would be just simply taking advantage of another person. Taking advantage of their lack of knowledge, taking advantage of the fact that they're not aware of everything in a business deal or in an agreement or in an exchange. That's the same equivalent of stealing. This commandment is at the heart of that and at the root of that. Another way would be as an employee stealing time when you're being paid to work. So if you're being paid to do a job, but you're using your time, you're using that time for personal time, or worse, you're using that time to build your own business or get paid doing other things, that is theft. That is stealing. You're stealing pay from your employer. Another way would be unfair business dealings or practices, underhanded ways of if you own a business or you're making deals with people. Deals that are in your favor, not in the other person's favor, and you're doing that knowingly. Another way that people steal is through tithing. According to Scripture, that's actually stealing from God. That's the way that God looks at that. Another way people steal is by maybe overcharging someone for something. Selling something that is knowingly broken or of inferior quality. Going back on your word or promise can be stealing. I'll give you an example. I had a guy one time. This guy was actually in the ministry. This is when I was in college, before I got married or anything like that. And this guy was in the ministry. He was a minister at one of the churches I went to. And he came up to me one day and he gave me a compound bow and arrow. And I was excited. I'd want to get into bow hunting, and he gave me this bow. He was planning to get a new one. And I was excited. It had a nice case with it and some arrows. So I went and got some new arrows and a target and arrowheads, and I'd started practicing with it, and I was planning to, start hunting with it that winter. And right before deer season opened, the guy came back around to me, and this had been probably 4 or 5 months. And the guy came back around and he said, hey, you know that bow and arrow I let you borrow? He's like, I kind of want to get that back. And I'm like, he didn't let me borrow that. He gave it to me. But he had intentions of getting another one. For whatever reasons, he didn't get it. And then so when deer season came back around and he still didn't have a bow, apparently he thought to himself, well, I can just get it back from this other guy by saying that I let him borrow it. Well, he didn't. That's not what he said. That was not his intentions. It was very clear in the beginning that was not his intentions, but it was convenient at the moment to get what he wanted. And later I found out that this was a pattern and a habit in this person's character. I didn't know that at the time. Well, that may seem small, but going back on your word, doing things to other people is a form of stealing. And I'll show you this from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. This is a powerful passage that deals with the mentality that believers should have when it comes to being wronged by another person. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 5, he's dealing with believers who are suing other believers in the church or taking other believers to court. He says, I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is not one wise person among you who is able to arbitrate between his brothers? Instead, believer goes to court against believer, and that before unbelievers. Therefore, to have legal disputes against one another is already a moral failure for you. Why not rather put up with injustice? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you act unjustly and cheat, and you do this to believers. So, if you read this whole passage, you get a better understanding of what he's talking about. We only read a few verses. But essentially what he's saying is, guys, this is not anything like Christ. You're suing each other, you're fighting for your rights, you're fighting for your way. And I love his phrase. He says, why not rather just be cheated? Why not rather just experience injustice than sue another person and take them to court, especially when we're talking about believers? Now, he doesn't say there's anything wrong with trying to resolve a dispute. His main point here is you should go to the church leaders. This is what Paul thinks. He said you should take this to the church leaders and let them decide it and just be happy with whatever judgment is made there. But he said by taking it to the court, and trying to sue a person, he said, what kind of testimony does that bring? That you're suing another believer and you're doing this in front of unbelievers. What kind of testimony does that give to other people? So he asked this question, why not just rather be defrauded? Another translation says, why not just rather be cheated? Why not just rather experience injustice? And I love this mentality, because what's at the root of this mentality is he's saying, why not be more concerned about other people and just let God be concerned about you? And if it means that you experience being cheated or being wronged, but yet you kept your character and you were able to walk in love towards another person, he said that's really the better path. So there we have Commandments 7 and 8. Do not commit adultery, do not steal. And again, the heart of what God was saying there is do not defraud your neighbor, but instead treat others as you would want to be treated.